So yeah, Iran's president did something that doesn't happen very often during a war. He wrote directly to the American public, not through the State Department, not through some diplomatic back channel or news media, just straight over the heads of everyone whose job depends on essentially managing the narrative about why we need to keep Iran surrounded, sanctioned, and a bad day away from getting boots on the ground invaded. And obviously, the form matters here. When the head of the state has to root around your government to talk to you, that's obviously not diplomacy breaking down. That's someone pointing out that the conflict isn't actually between regular people in two countries, it's between regular people and the machinery that claims to represent them while doing something completely different. Because here's obviously the thing about Iran and the US hostility, it requires constant maintenance on the US side. It doesn't just exist on its own. American workers have no material beef with the Iranian people. Your life doesn't get any better because Iran's economy is being crippled. You don't wake up safer because there's a carrier group parked in the Persian Gulf. The antagonism has to be actively produced year after year through threat inflation and sanctions that fail their stated goals but somehow never get reversed. And Pezeshkian's letter works by making that gap visible. He doesn't need to convince you Iran is virtuous or that the Islamic Republic is some model society. He just needs to show you that the story you're being told why this conflict exists serves somebody else's interest entirely. And once you see that gap between what you're told and what actually benefits you, the whole structure starts looking different. And that gap, again, starts in 1953. And the CIA orchestrated a coup against Iran's democratically elected government because their prime minister, Mossadegh, nationalized the oil industry, not threatened to or considered. He actually did it. And the people of Iran said, these are our resources. We're going to control them. And the response wasn't negotiation, it was regime change. And that's not the beginning of a long history of diplomatic disagreement, right? That's the creation of a permanent structural hostility because that coup taught every Iranian who came after them that was the way in which political development took place, democratic or otherwise. And that no matter what you did, no matter what political struggle you took up, it would be interrupted whenever it conflicted with the Western resource extraction machine. And the lesson there wasn't play nice and you'll be treated fairly. The lesson is your sovereignty is negotiable based on our interest. And every conversation about Iran that starts in 1979 with the revolution or the hostage crisis is deliberately erasing this foundation. Iran's irrational refusal to trust Western diplomatic promises didn't come from in a vacuum. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from watching what happened when they trusted the democratic process and got overthrown for it. And the pattern continues, right? When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, the United States backed Saddam Hussein, not quietly, but actively. And with intelligence sharing, weapons, diplomatic cover, Iraq fought an 8 year war that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Iranians, and the U.S. helped. Why? Because Iran's revolutionary government had overthrown the Shah and nationalized its assets. And the punishment for refusing client state status was an entire war of aggression fought with American support. Iraq used chemical weapons extensively against Iranian troops and civilians, and the United States provided the battlefield intelligence that helped those attacks work while blocking intentional condemnation at the UN. And this isn't ancient history either. It's not ancient history that has nothing to do with the current policy. Iran's entire military posture develops directly from this experience. The country fought a defensive war for 8 years, got gassed, received zero international protection, and survived through internal mobilization. To this day, and then American analysis look at Iran's missile programs and regional proxy relationships and call it aggressive expansion or aggressive posture. And Iran didn't expand into the region. Iran built the capacity to prevent a repeat of the 1980s. And the difference there is everything. And this is where the threat narrative does its most important work. It inverts reality. American military forces operate from bases in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey. The U.S. Navy patrols in the Persian Gulf continuously. American aircraft fly surveillance along Iranian borders day in, day out. And this forward development surrounding a country that hasn't invaded another state since 1979. And, you know, but the whole framing, again, is that Iran developing missiles that can reach those bases is somehow aggressive. Iran supporting Hezbollah or Iraqi militias becomes destabilizing. The inversion requires pretending geography doesn't exist. Iranian missiles can only reach American forces because American forces position themselves on Iran's borders. That's not a threat assessment, that's describing a map in existing material reality. Same logic appears for the nuclear program. US intelligence hasn't concluded that Iran has built a bomb, but the research program alone justifies sanctions and military threats. Meanwhile, Israel's actual nuclear arsenal draws no response. And the selectivity isn't a flaw in the analysis, it's the point. The issue isn't nuclear proliferation. The issue isn't even a state that has a secret nuclear program, because if it was, Israel wouldn't have one. The issue is which state gets to have military capabilities that complicate American freedom of action. And then there's the sanctions. Comprehensive sanctions started in the 1990s, intensified through the turn of the century, into the 2000s, into the aughts, into the 2020s, into the pandemic era, and now into the second Trump era. The stated goal is forcing policy change, either regime collapse or fundamental shifts on the nuclear program or their regional activity, governance structure. 4 decades later, Iran's government is stable, their nuclear program continues, and their regional influence has only expanded. And by any measure connected to the stated objectives, the sanctions and the pressure that has been put on them has failed completely. Iran's literacy rate has gone up around 50% since the revolution to over 85% now. University enrollment exploded. The country developed domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing, aerospace capabilities, highly advanced manufacturing production, all under sanctions designed to cripple exactly that kind of development. And this policy's continuation after obvious failures proves the state's objectives were never the real ones. Sanctions serve other functions. They maintain pressure that justifies military presence, they create economic hardship that gets blamed on the Iranian government, and they sustain the political coalition that benefits from permanent tension. And this is the post 9/11 diagnosis and the pattern that is applied to Iran. The policy persists not because it works, but because dismantling it would require abandoning the institutional interest that it actually serves. And the third party, obviously, in all of this comes in when the United States gives Israel over $3 billion a year in direct military aid, plus additional funding for missile defense, weapons stockpile, intelligence sharing. And this continues regardless of which party is in power, regardless of Israeli actions that contradict stated American policy. Iran represents Israel's primary regional counterweight, the only state with sufficient military capability, economic resources, and the political will to constrain Israel's freedom of action and impunity. And American hostility towards Iran serves Israel strategic objectives by maintaining pressure on that counterweight. Whether it serves American workers in a different question, obviously, with a pretty clear answer that anybody who's watching this knows, um, because well, Americans, in the sense of the structural sense of how people in America and people who live in the imperial core benefit from the hegemony that is established through these types of imperial adventures. It just increases your energy costs. Permanent Middle East deployments don't make you safer. They create the conditions that generate American anti-Americanism globally. You know, you're bearing the cost of someone else's regional strategy while being told it's about your security. And Ian's appeal works by making this triangular structural visible to you. He's not arguing, Iranian and American interests align perfectly, because obviously they don't. He's showing you that the current policy serves a third party while imposing cost on both populations and the gaps between them. And that's the direct appeal that to the American people reveals here. And every escalation makes reversing course harder and harder and harder. And when the US designates Iran's a Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization, it creates legal structures that criminalize normal engagement. And when sanctions expand to secondary targets, they force global compliance regardless of other countries' interests. And when military infrastructure gets built for Iran contingencies, it generates bureaucratic momentum towards using it. And that's what we're seeing now. Military planners who have spent their career preparing Iran operations don't easily accept that it was all for naught. It was all wasted effort. Defense contractors who built Iran specific capabilities don't surrender those revenue streams. Political careers built on Iran hawkishness doesn't suddenly reverse. The longer that it goes, the more structurally resistant to change it becomes. And the real audience for this letter isn't policymakers. It's not even you specifically. The audience is the gap between those things, the visible space between what you're told justifies Iran's policy and what the policy actually accomplishes for you in this moment materially. And the historical reference to 1953 and the Iran-Iraq War established the current policy that has roots that you didn't vote for. And development data, despite sanctions, shows stated objectives have obviously failed. And the direct appeal to the American people itself proves normal diplomatic channels don't include your input. That time is over. And making that gap visible doesn't require you to think Iran is virtuous or that the Islamic Republic is somehow admirable to an average American. It requires recognizing that someone is lying about who benefits from the permanent conflict that we're walking into. And once you see that gap, the question becomes very clear, right? Not is Iran dangerous, but who needs me to believe Iran is dangerous and why? And that question, that's the one that the entire apparatus exists to prevent you from asking. And this letter that routes around the State Department to land directly at your feet is designed to make you ask those questions